have a Twitter account. That's a new thing I started doing. So anyway, JavaScript is asynchronous. And that is such a great thing to say, but when you get into dealing with multiple synchronous things, then it becomes a nightmare sometimes, especially if you come from a background of like PHP or just some kind of set language. So in this case, we have a typical AJAX request where we're going to the server and we want to get something, and when that succeeds, do something with it. That's pretty common. I'm sure we've all done that. And we have this situation where we need to wait for that to happen. You know, that could be on a mobile device, take a couple seconds, who knows? So we get this problem a lot. This comes up in jQuery support a lot, where someone says, great, I will just declare a variable, I'll do my AJAX stuff, and I'll keep the variable in scope, so that when I return it on line 12, then I can get it on line 15 when I call that function. And of course, they get undefined. And that makes sense when you think about that it's creating this variable. It's doing this asynchronous action, and the function returns that variable before the AJAX call even thinks about doing anything. It hasn't even tried to initiate a connection yet. So it's like ordering pizza and then just running to the door right away and expecting the pizza to be there. And you have to at least give them, 30 seconds to make it. So there's this asynchronous problem. We're used to something happening in a synchronous manner, where the language is parse level, and it goes from top to bottom. We can call functions and execute a block, and that all makes sense. But there's these unknowables that we have to deal with. There's event handlers that are going to happen, are going to be fired at random points. We don't know when the user's going to click something or interact with something. We don't know when the AJAX call is going to actually come back, when the image is actually done downloading. Those kind of things, we don't know. And even like set timeout, that's never even an exact time. If you say 1,000 milliseconds, it might be 1,001. So let's talk about, I'm going to skip that. This is supposed to be a 45-minute talk, so I might rush through a couple things. If we were making a plugin, like a validation plugin, and we had some basic form stuff, like getting the name, getting the email out of a form, and we just wanted to check if it's there. So we're just, we made a simple plugin that's going to do that. And if it was just a synchronous language, we didn't have to deal with this problem. Something like this would seem reasonable. Would be to get those fields, have like a Boolean that's kind of defaulting to valid or not. Go to the server, is this valid, is this legit, and then return that information back and use it, which would be on line 13, it's setting whether valid was true or false, if data was from the server was legit, and then 17, finally returning that state. But it doesn't work because AJAX is just creating that request. It's not actually resolving any data at that point in time. It's just representing a connection to a server. And so in this case, this won't work. So you always need to execute a function when you have something that's going to happen asynchronously. That's going to happen. That's the way it is. At least until we have like yields and generators that are, make that a lot easier. But callbacks are going to be a way of life, and so we have this need to be able to manage our callbacks. So we say, well, fine, we'll use the function. We have this go get it function. It's just going to go to the server and get some information, and we'll just pass in a function to that to then operate on that data when it happens. So line 5 calls that function that was passed in, call me back, with the data that came back from the server. And then that's used on line 9 in that anonymous function. And that works great. It totally works. But it's messy. And that's because now our function that is doing the AJAX request has to know information about the function that's being passed in. What kind of arguments is it expecting? How many functions am I going to have to call? Those kind of things start to become a problem when you have functions in different parts of your application that you want to talk to each other. And so decoupling becomes a problem because you're having to worry about which ones to call back. You have to worry about a failure condition and how the hell do you manage that? And it's just messy. So we need something that can manage all of these callbacks. We need something that can handle success and that can handle failure, that we can put from one part of our application and easily transport it to another part of our application, and has a consistent API. If we're going to be using this all over the place, it needs to be something pretty solid and simple. So that's deferred. And that's what we're going to be talking about, surprisingly, because that's the title of this talk. So it's nothing really that special. It's an object that holds success callbacks, it holds failure callbacks, and it can call either sets of those. And if we look at creating one, on line 2, we're just using the $.deferred method that creates this object for us. And one of the methods that it exposes is done. So when this deferred is done, when it's finished, run this function. And oh, my slide deck is a little, it's not showing the top very well. Well, hopefully you guys can see it now. Actually, can't I be smart and fix this really quick? If I was a web developer. Oh, see, this is why I'm not a designer. Oh, sorry, that's not going to work because of the way the slides are positioned. I tried. Anyway, so in this case, we're putting a function to be called when the deferred is done. And then on line 8, we're saying finish, resolve. And so that will then look at the deferred and say, hey, is there any success callbacks that I need to call? Well, we passed one in on line 4, we passed an anonymous function, so it will run that. And it did. It says done, done, done on top. So there's some pieces of a deferred besides done. There's fail, which is the failure callbacks that you can put onto that. There's also progress, which can take functions to call when there's a progress of that. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Then it's half convenience method, and that the first argument is the done callback and the second argument is the fail callback. But it also has the ability to introduce a new deferred, actually promise. I got an example for that too, so if that doesn't make sense, don't worry. And then always, which is something I lobbied for, so that we could have something that would happen when either condition happened. And then on the deferred side, where you're actually saying this happened or didn't, you have resolve, which we just showed, and resolve with, which lets you pass in a context. And then the same with reject, reject with. And notify fires progress events. So the promise is the best freaking part. So you have this deferred object, and it's managing basically the state of this thing with callbacks on it. And so it has the ability to resolve with content or reject with content. And so in this case, deferred done is happening on both line 3 and 6. And when we resolve that, both of those run. Let's skip fail because you can figure out how that works. Let's get into more goodness. Okay, here we go. So in this case, I'm going to resolve the deferred after 5 seconds, so lines 5, 6, and 7. And that resolution is going to affect the state of the deferred. Now, what I'm returning in line 9 is basically a public copy of the deferred. So it doesn't have things like resolve and reject. It has just, then, always, done, fail. So it's going to let you still have those methods to attach callbacks to, but it's not going to let you actually mess with the guts of it. And you can imagine if you have a service or a function that's doing some AJAX request, you really don't want some other part of your application saying, oh, by the way, stop doing that. Like that could get pretty messy unless you've exposed an API to do that manually. So this helps keep part of your applications decoupled well and without mess, and still lets you take advantage of that API. So it has exposes a public API, it can never resolve and reject, and it can still add those done and fail handlers. So a promise is a component of a deferred. here the two terms kind of used interchangeably sometimes. I mean, they both typically in conversation just represent an asynchronous thing that helps you manage all of your callbacks. But they are different, and that the deferred can do everything with adding callbacks, resolving and rejecting, and it can return a promise. And then the promise can do everything except resolving and rejecting. So you already covered that it has those same methods. Checking the state of that there's a state method on there that will give you a string of the current status. So if you want to check if that's resolved yet or rejected yet, you can do that. And all the methods are chainable. So if there's something where you want to do a done callback and then a fail callback, and of course jQuery is known for chaining, so why wouldn't we do it here? So you can do something asynchronous, which assuming is going to return a promise, and then you can just add a bunch of handlers if you needed to. Done and fail and always incidentally take multiple functions as each argument, but if you wanted to be explicit like this, or maybe you like that for code style, you could do that. And they can only be resolved once, which is actually really handy because if you have callbacks attached later, you'll still get that original resolved value. And because they can only be resolved once, you know that the state of that action can't be modified and changed, and that helps with a lot of potential bugs. So that basically illustrates that. Okay, so we have some changes to them. I'm actually gonna made a better example for that, so I'm gonna skip over that and talk about progress really quick. So in this case, you see here that we're doing multiple timeouts on lines 4 and 9 and 14. And we're resolving after 7 seconds. But after 2 seconds, we're sending a notify. So we're calling notify with just a status in the sense of only 2 seconds done so far, and then further down, only 5 seconds. And so the top is showing the result of that. I don't think I have the handler here, but it's basically getting that something happened after 2 seconds, something happened after 5 seconds, and then something happened when everything was done. I apologize, I had 15 minutes to add some more code samples to this, so I apologize if they're not quite perfect. But that lets you communicate from your deferred to actual parts of your application in a progress way. If this was something you actually had information on, I'm on step 5 through 7, you could send that information out and it could be subscribed to with progress. But it doesn't actually affect the state of anything, it's just information. You're basically using that as an event limiter. Okay, so then, we changed it a little bit to be more like promises A in 1.8, because promises A lets you take a promise, so let's say you have a done callback. Well, here, I'll just show you. We have a do later function, pretty simple. Just remember that it does something in X seconds, and after that amount of seconds, it returns that as the deferred result, just the results for that time. Very simple function for illustration purposes. So imagine we have step 1, we're going to do later in 400 milliseconds. Step 2, once step 1 is finished, then run this function on line 3. And go ahead and log that we finished in 400 milliseconds, but return another promise that's going to be 400 times 2. So what happens is step 2, the actual variable assignment, the actual ultimate thing that gets assigned to that, is a new promise that is the result of this whole action. So step 2 now depends that step 1 finished. And it won't resolve until another 800 milliseconds. So we've now done one asynchronous action, and we've now been able to be dependent on another one. Same thing with step 3, we're saying, okay, we got that done, do it again. So now this time it's 1600 milliseconds. And then finally, step 3, once you're done, log what happened. And so I can go back to that to load. Did it at 400, did it in 800, and then did it at 1600. And those are all dependent. And so what's cool is if in step 1, if I returned a failing promise, that something, let's say I did an AJAX request and it failed instead, that would halt the whole process. So when you have steps that rely on each other, this kind of ability in that is very useful. So let's talk about AJAX, because that's a pretty synchronous thing. We talked about that as an example. And that returns to jQXHR, which has all the basic stuff of XHR in the sense of like what's going on with the AJAX request, and you can get stuff off of that later. But it also exposes these promise methods. It has a promise built into it. And so in this case, we can do an AJAX request and just use the .done syntax to attach a function to that and operate on it when it's finished and get the same data back. It does have the success and error methods as properties of that as well that you can use. I really don't do it. It's there, you'll see it in the documentation, but don't use it because you're mixing APIs. If you want to use success and error, use those in the object and the callback arguments, or callback parameters for the object. But if you want to use the promise, use the actual promise methods, which are done and fail, and then and always. So why do we need to worry about that with AJAX though, if we can still put in a success callback like we've been doing for probably years? Well, now we can take our AJAX function, put it in a part of our application that's just managing the service, and return something that can be bound to anywhere. So now I have this jQXHR somewhere in my application, and now I can just call .done and attach functionality to that. I don't have to worry about what's going on. I don't have to pass in special callbacks or anything. It's as if I just did the AJAX request then. And what, well, okay, I'll talk about one other thing before I get to that. Sorry, there's another cool thing that helps with this is caching. But let's talk about another way that we can apply deferreds. For this slide deck, I create iframes for each slide so that the console log that comes down from the top is unique every time, and it has a sandbox. So I wanted to create an iframe, so I did that the typical jQuery way, create an element that's an iframe, add the source in, and append it to the body. But what happens is I do that, and I want to get stuff from the iframe. In this case, there's a function on window of this iframe called YASD. And the problem is, if I log that, I get undefined, which is what's being logged up top barely. And so why is this happening? Well, it's because I'm running into the same problem before. It's creating this iframe element, and it's putting the source into it, and that's still loaded. So my function keeps on executing. It tries to log something that isn't there because the iframe just hasn't instantiated yet. And so what we need to do is take care of that asynchronous action using a deferred. I create the deferred on line 3, do all the same stuff, but instead on line 9, I bind to the load event. So once that is actually loaded, then I resolve the deferred, which is great because then I can just have this create iframe function, and I'm using that same API that I use for AJAX, that I use for any other part of my application. I just say whenever this thing that may or may not be asynchronous is done, run this function. Which is cool because maybe iframe was cached, and maybe it didn't have to create it. Maybe there was no load event, it just returned the iframe. Either way, this part of my application, these 4 lines of code, don't care. And that's great. Let's talk about being lazy. So you have a situation where you have multiple asynchronous things going on. And so when takes any number of arguments and wraps them in a deferred for you, which is awesome. Because now I can do things like throw in on line 5, I have this asynchronous function called a name, and it just gets a random name from the server. And so I'm calling on line 5, I'm passing in that function, I'm passing in a string, I'm passing in a function again, and then it's an object, it's just taking random shit. And then on line 7, 8, 9, and 10, it's logging the result of that. And so even though argument 2 and 4, the string text, or argument text and the object there, I mean, those resolve